The Pentagon's secret map of the true pole shift disaster. The classified map. The file opens mid-sentence. No author, no signature, just a title block half erased with black bars. Beneath the smudge, a faint seal reads, Department of Defense, Restricted Geophysical Assessment. The next page looks nothing like a report. It's a map, latitude grids, warped coastlines, and entire continents tinted blood red, marked only with cryptic codes. Z1, Sector Delta, uninhabitable. The shapes don't match any modern geography. It could be a projection of the world to come, or a warning drafted for one that's already gone. According to digital forensics chatter, the file surfaced briefly on a secured Pentagon network in 2018 before appearing on an encrypted defense contractor forum. The post vanished within an hour, leaving behind a single line of metadata, classified geophysical projection, derived from magnetic realignment simulations. Within days, screenshots spread through archivist circles claiming the document outlined a federal contingency for large-scale crustal displacement. That's the question that's fueled every investigation since. Was the Pentagon quietly mapping an impending pole shift? Now, before your mind jumps straight into conspiracy territory, know this. The annotations on that image line up, almost perfectly, with long-running Navy geodetic surveys meant to monitor changes in Earth's magnetic field. But certain lines didn't match anything from public datasets. They outlined what looked like inland seas forming across the Midwest, shorelines receding from Europe, and over the North Atlantic, a line of text, almost illegible but partially readable under contrast enhancement. Population Migration Corridor Plan. Nobody inside the Department of Defense has ever confirmed that the document is real. No origin file has surfaced, but the metadata tags reportedly reference magshift_PJ and crustal variation contingency 0034A, terms that don't appear in any official project registry. So people started asking questions. Was this a training simulation? A modeling exercise for rising seas? Or, if the rumors are true, a projection made from data classified under an older program connected to John Thomas, the man whose ideas the CIA once hid under lock and key? See, the fascination with the map isn't just about the geography, it's about where that geography leads. Because in the 190 SAXS, an engineer named Thomas claimed Earth's outer shell periodically slips over its molten interior, shifting oceans, sinking continents, and wiping civilizations from existence. He said it had happened before. He said it would happen again. His book, The Adam and Eve Story, became the foundation for what modern historians call catastrophic pole shift theory. And more importantly, it vanished, classified by the CIA almost immediately after publication. So when today's leaked image appeared, showing the continents contorted in eerily familiar ways, researchers compared it to diagrams from the few surviving pages of Thomas's manuscript. The resemblance was uncanny. Flooded coastlines, repositioned poles, the same predicted disaster zones highlighted, as if someone had used his book as a blueprint. If that connection is real, it means one of two things. Either the Pentagon was recycling discarded pseudoscience for scenario planning, or someone believed Thomas had been right all along. The problem is, the secrecy fits too neatly. Whenever government silence collides with apocalyptic speculation, you get a perfect storm of curiosity and fear. Add in the recent UAP testimony and decades of rumored black projects, and suddenly the edges start to blur. One classified map becomes a symbol of everything the public suspects is being hidden from them. But the truth might be more complicated and stranger than either side expects. Let's rewind for a second. Where would such an idea even come from? The concept that Earth could suddenly tilt on its axis isn't new. Early explorers once thought shifting magnetic readings meant the poles had physically moved. Later, in the mid-20th century, a professor named Charles Hapgood refined the notion into something that sounded scientific: Earth crust displacement. He suggested that ice accumulating at the poles creates an imbalance, forcing the entire crust to slide over the mantle in one sudden, catastrophic motion. Einstein wrote a cautious foreword to Hapgood's book in 1958, calling the theory interesting but unproven. That single endorsement gave it a kind of immortality in alternative science circles. By the early 190 SAXS, when the Cold War blurred the line between plausible research and classified speculation, the idea of global cataclysm wasn't just the stuff of science fiction. It was a potential security risk. Imagine living through the Cuban Missile Crisis and hearing that the planet might decide to wipe itself out, no bombs required. Government think tanks were already modeling fallout patterns en masse. Migrations, adding a natural cataclysm to the mix wouldn't be much of a leap. That's the historical climate in which John Thomas appeared. He framed Hapgood's academic concept in mythic language, connecting geological cataclysms to biblical floods and ancient resets of civilization. His book claimed to prove that every few thousand years, the poles leap to new locations, triggering massive tidal waves and continental reconfiguration. The title, The Adam and Eve Story, wasn't metaphorical. He argued that humanity has been rebooted many times, with each era ending in fire, ice, or flood. Shortly after publication, the CIA classified it. We don't know why. Some say Thomas worked briefly with Air Force intelligence, giving the agency an excuse to bury anything remotely tied to him. Others think it frightened policymakers because it predicted the kind of panic no government could control. Whatever the reason, only a heavily redacted version resurfaced decades later. So when someone today uncovers a digital map inside a Pentagon archive, labeled with mysterious magnetic terms, can you blame people for seeing a connection? The overlap between defense secrecy, planetary science, and myth is exactly where mistrust grows. Every redaction, every no comment, becomes evidence of something bigger. Especially now, when the Pentagon itself is under scrutiny for shielding unconventional research behind the term UAP. Think about the timing. As magnetic field data show rapid weakening, the North Pole sliding toward Siberia faster than expected, the military's geophysical units quietly ramp up mapping projects described as infrastructure resilience modeling. Then a supposedly leaked image appears forecasting catastrophic flooding. To the average observer, that looks less like environmental planning and more like advance notice of an extinction-level event. But let's pause here. Whether that document represents a real top-secret contingency or a fragment of Cold War paranoia repackaged for the internet, its appearance resurrected one enduring mystery. Why did the government ever classify a book claiming to describe the same thing? To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning of the pole shift idea itself, before the map, before the CIA redactions, when the line between geology and prophecy first started to blur. Because if we trace how a fringe theory became state secrets material, maybe we'll finally see why the Pentagon would bother drawing a map of the end of the world at all. And that's where the story really begins. Section 1. Birth of the pole shift idea. The story of the pole shift begins quietly, decades before the phrase became the centerpiece of internet theories and government rumor. It starts in libraries and lecture halls, not underground bunkers. And it begins with Charles Hapgood, a history professor who refused to stop asking a forbidden question. Could the surface of Earth itself be capable of sudden movement? Hapgood wasn't a geologist. He taught at Keene State College in New Hampshire, fascinated by the way old maps seemed to depict ice-free coastlines of Antarctica, as if ancient civilizations had seen a world that existed before the current polar caps formed. In 1952, he developed a bold hypothesis to explain it. Instead of the continents drifting gradually, Hapgood proposed that Earth's thin crust occasionally slips as a hole over the molten mantle beneath, like the loose skin of an orange. It was a single, elegant mechanism that could explain dramatic climate swings and mysterious ancient flood legends all at once. Most of the scientific community dismissed him, but his arguments had just enough mathematics and historical evidence to intrigue one important reader, Albert Einstein. After years of correspondence, Einstein agreed to write a foreword for Hapgood's 1958 book Earth's Shifting Crust. In 2 cautious pages, he praised the idea as interesting and worthy of consideration, though he admitted the evidence remained incomplete. That short endorsement gave Hapgood something no fringe scientist had ever possessed: credibility. Popular magazines picked up the story immediately. Newspapers ran headlines about Einstein's lost catastrophe theory. For the public, it was irresistible, an idea that Earth itself might violently reset every few thousand years. Cinema was already filled with mushroom clouds and crumbling cities. Now science seemed to hint at a more ancient, unstoppable apocalypse. Meanwhile, inside the establishment, the interest took a more pragmatic turn. The United States was deep in the Cold War. Strategists and psychologists debated how civilization would cope with existential fear. First nuclear, then cosmic. Government agencies quietly collected studies on human behavior during catastrophes. In that environment, Hapgood's theory wasn't just geological speculation. It represented a model for the ultimate natural enemy, an event humanity couldn't deter or win against, only endure. By the early 190 SAXS, as the space program accelerated and military think tanks began cataloging natural threats that could rival nuclear war, Hapgood's ideas re-entered discussion inside defense circles. His calculations placed the last crustal shift about 10,000 years ago, close to the end of the last ice age. To policy planners, that coincidence was alarming. If the cycle repeated on schedule, another displacement could be due within millennia, not an immediate threat, but close enough to merit curiosity. At the same time, the scientific consensus hardened against the concept. Plate tectonics was gaining evidence, offering a more consistent explanation for continental motion. Geologists pointed out that Hapgood conflated magnetic pole migration with physical crustal drift. Still, his theory held one psychological advantage: it offered drama. Gradual motion doesn't make people stay awake at night. Sliding continents that drown civilizations do. That tension, between dry data and dreadful possibility, drew in a new generation of thinkers. And one of them, a soft-spoken electrical engineer named John Thomas, would take Hapgood's cautious speculation and turn it into prophecy. Thomas admired Hapgood, but felt he'd underestimated the violence of what happens when the crust moves. Instead of thousands of years, he argued the shift could occur in hours. Oceans would leave their basins, hurled across continents. Mountains would flatten, deserts would freeze. He started connecting these imagined cataclysms with mythic accounts: the biblical flood, the destruction of Atlantis, legends of fire and darkness. His conviction was simple: these were not stories, but eyewitness records of previous displacements. To scientists, Thomas's claims read like fantasy archaeology. To the US government in the mid-196s, however, anything blending science with global panic was delicate terrain. The Cuban Missile Crisis was only 3 years behind them. Civil defense agencies were drafting plans for mass relocation after nuclear fallout. Geophysical catastrophe sounded uncomfortably similar. Even unproven theories could spread fear if amplified by the wrong voices. Still, within academic circles there was a flicker of genuine curiosity. A few physicists wondered if large-scale redistribution of polar ice could change Earth's moment of inertia enough to nudge the crust. The calculations didn't work, but the thought experiment lingered. If the balance could change slowly, might it also collapse suddenly under extreme conditions? That question earned funding in small amounts, mostly from private donors and defense-linked foundations eager to model global disruption scenarios. No official validation followed, yet the connection was enough to pull the topic toward classified research spaces. Hapgood himself, frustrated by skepticism, turned increasingly toward historical documentation, maps, myths, and ancient engineering anomalies, to show evidence that prior civilizations had once known true north existed somewhere else on the horizon. By the mid-196s his reputation was fading, but his correspondence with government researchers continued quietly. Letters described geomagnetic instability reviews and cross-disciplinary disaster modeling. There's no proof those ever evolved into formal programs, but the language sounds eerily similar to what later appears in the metadata of the leaked Pentagon map. The seed had been planted. Publicly, Hapgood remained a gentleman scholar who argued that cataclysms could reset humanity, but also inspire renewal. Privately, his theory drifted into the same vault of speculative models that defense analysts used for black swan planning, low probability, high-impact events. When Thomas entered that world, his hybrid of theology, mythology, and pseudoscience elevated the threat from abstract possibility to urgent warning. You can see the turning point coming. Hapgood had proposed a shift every 10,000 years. Thomas shortened the cycle to 6,500 and claimed another was approaching. Hapgood treated crustal movement as a natural process within physics. Thomas described it as an unstoppable divine pattern. One read like an academic paper, the other like classified prophecy. What made Einstein's polite curiosity toward Hapgood so pivotal was how it lingered in collective memory. Whenever a scientist with real credentials dismissed pole shift speculation, believers could counter with, "But Einstein said it was possible." That single line, detached from its context, would echo through the decades, providing a veneer of legitimacy to every new iteration of the idea, from talk show discussions to intelligence memos. By the time Thomas published The Adam and Eve story in 1966, Hapgood's original work had faded into niche history. Yet his conceptual framework remained the invisible backbone behind it all. Without Hapgood's question, there would have been no classified book, no redacted pages, and no, decades later, geophysical projection map. So when we ask why the Pentagon might care about magnetic instability today, it's not just about modern science. It's about inheritance, the way a half-dismissed academic idea became a forbidden narrative linking physics, prophecy, and policy. The story of the pole shift didn't begin with secrecy. But once it touched that world, it never left. Next comes the man who carried it there, and the moment the idea was locked behind a classified stamp bearing 3 letters, CIA. Section 2. John Thomas and the Banned Book. By 1966, John Thomas wasn't just speculating, he was warning. He'd taken Hapgood's slow, geological hypothesis and stripped away the patience. To him, it wasn't about tectonic creep or shifting magnetic fields. It was about sudden biblical upheaval. A complete crustal slip. Oceans racing across continents. Civilization reduced to myth in a single day. Thomas had an unusual resume for an apocalypse prophet. He was trained as an electrical engineer, worked briefly with the Air Force, and claimed access to classified research. Colleagues described him as earnest, brilliant, and slightly mystical, someone who believed physics and theology were 2 sides of the same truth. His writing style reflected that blend. Equations sat beside quotes from Genesis. Magnetohydrodynamics shared paragraphs with angels and ancient tablets. He seemed convinced the scientific and the spiritual were simply describing the same cycles in different languages. That year he self-published the Adam and Eve story, The History of Cataclysms. The title alone set expectations, part scripture, part science. Inside, Thomas laid out a vision where every 6,500 years, Earth's magnetic poles reversed so violently that the crust detached from the mantle and realigned in hours. He described it like a gear slipping, the outer layer rotating around the core until centrifugal stress tore oceans from their basins. In his telling, the last disaster sank Atlantis, froze mammoths mid-stride, and left humanity starting over in caves. The next, he implied, wasn't far off. Within weeks, the book vanished. Review copies stopped circulating. Thomas mentioned once, in an interview fragment reprinted decades later, that government interest exceeded expectation. Not long after, records show the CIA obtained a copy under internal requisition. The classification stamp followed soon after. Limited distribution, Division 5. Only 57 pages survived public release. 200 plus vanished into storage. To outsiders, the move looked absurd. Why classify pseudoscience about pole flips? But context matters. In 1966, NASA was racing toward the moon. The space age had opened a new frontier for national security. Any theory, even speculative, that implied fragility of the planet itself cut close to paranoia already gripping military planners. Documents from that decade show intelligence analysts modeling global chaos catalysts, events that could render nations ungovernable. Thomas's manuscript described exactly that, framed through cosmic inevitability. Some historians think the book's problem wasn't its science, but its psychology. Predicting that cities would vanish overnight could feed Cold War panic faster than any missile warning. The CIA, ever cautious about information warfare, often classified material that might adversely affect public stability, even when scientifically dubious. The Adam and Eve story fit that category perfectly. It sounded technical enough to fool readers while striking directly at existential fear. The sanitized version released long afterward only deepened the mystery. Entire sections were missing, tables, maps, diagrams stripped from the middle pages. What remained hinted at what had been cut. There were references to polar migration vectors, continental inertial thresholds, and something Thomas called the hydraulic inversion. In his language, that meant the oceans themselves becoming the engine of destruction once centrifugal energy overcame gravitational containment. Scientists scoffed, but readers sensed hidden knowledge behind the black lines. The redaction sparked exactly the rumor cycle the CIA likely wanted to avoid. Decades later, when the Freedom of Information Act forced release of partial pages, forums lit up overnight. People began cross-referencing the fragmentary data with satellite imagery and seismic patterns. Others noticed that Thomas's rough coordinates for new coastlines overlapped with maps produced by FEMA centuries later for disaster modeling. Coincidence? Maybe. But the absence of an official explanation guaranteed that everything missing looked intentional. Thomas himself faded from public record after the late 190 SAXS. By some accounts, he pursued private research into consciousness and remote viewing, a field that years later the U.S. military quietly experimented with under Project Stargate. The overlap was too tempting for conspiracy theorists to ignore. Soon, the Adam and Eve story became part of a larger mythology linking psychic phenomena, cataclysm cycles, and secret Earth change programs supposedly buried inside defense budgets. Behind all that noise sits a simpler possibility. The CIA's motive might have been bureaucratic, not sinister. The 190 SAXS intelligence community routinely swept up unconventional science for evaluation, sometimes to check if foreign powers were investing in it, sometimes just to keep odd ideas contained. Still, official silence handed mythmakers an endless runway. By refusing to clarify, the agency transformed an obscure paperback into a sacred relic of suppressed truth. Within those blacked-out paragraphs, people projected everything from alien intervention to predictive cartography. Decades before the internet, copies circulated underground among survivalist circles and alternative science clubs. Members annotated predictions, marking supposed next poles on home-drawn maps. Each generation added its own fears: nuclear winter, ozone collapse, Y2K, now magnetic reversal. The book's mystique grew because it lived in absence, pages nobody could read filled in by imagination. When the redacted file finally appeared on the CIA's digital reading room in 2013, curiosity exploded again. Uploaders noted how the PDF label used archival codes for unusual media, geological projections misfiled under psychological research. Whether clerical error or inside joke, the confusion kept speculation alive. Viewers zoomed into faded notations, convinced they saw predicted flood lines under the sensor bars. Amateur analysts began layering Thomas's partial figures onto NASA topographic data. One viral thread claimed the match between his equatorial migration path and contemporary measurements of magnetic pole drift exceeded random chance. From a storytelling perspective, Thomas achieved something remarkable. He gave myth a scientific accent. By writing in the tone of an engineer rather than a prophet, he bypassed skepticism and entered that strange zone where pseudoscience feels plausible. His diagrams looked like technical schematics, his phrases like classified briefings. That aura of authority made the suppression feel even more deliberate. If the book was nonsense, why hide it? If it wasn't nonsense, what did they know that we didn't? The fascination lay less in what he claimed than in who reacted. A government that had just mapped every inch of the moon apparently decided a self-published theory on Earth's destruction needed secrecy. For a Cold War public raised on duck-and-cover drills, the message was unmistakable. Even the people in charge seemed afraid. Over time, those disconnected facts, the engineer-author, the CIA redaction, the missing diagrams, converged into a single enduring narrative. There's knowledge about planetary catastrophe the authorities refused to share. Pop culture references spread it further. Talk shows in the 198s framed Thomas as the forbidden scientist. Eventually, his name resurfaced online whenever new data hinted at magnetic anomalies or rapid pole drift. Each modern discovery recycled his prophecy through updated vocabulary. Solar storms, coronal mass ejections, climate tipping points. Different causes, same doom cycle. Half a century later, when leaked Pentagon files labeled Geophysical Transition Zones began circulating, the comparison was immediate. The shapes on that map mirrored the outlines in Thomas's surviving figures. The coincidence was mathematical art, if nothing else, but to believers, it confirmed their fears that his book had never really been dismissed. It had been adopted. And here's the irony. The act of classifying the Adam and Eve story may have guaranteed its immortality. Without secrecy, it's just another eccentric theory. With it, it became evidence of conspiracy. That dynamic, between legitimate caution and enforced ignorance, defines the entire pole shift saga. Each redaction, each delayed release, stretches the line between science and myth until they meet again. Thomas promised that one day the truth would move mountains and oceans alike. Maybe he meant geological truth. Maybe he meant psychological. Either way, his words leaked into the bloodstream of cultural paranoia, setting the stage for what would unravel 50 years later, when declassified pages started appearing alongside UAP briefings and magnetic field data. Those coincidences aren't easily dismissed. They echo through every leaked diagram, every defense memo stamped restricted. The theory that once lived in a banned book now lingers in the metadata of modern science. But before we can judge what any of it means, we need to look at those recovered fragments themselves. The declassified pages that finally revealed what was hidden all along. What the declassified pages show. The declassification didn't come in one dramatic release. It came as a slow leak, fragments uploaded to the CIA's digital reading room between 2013 and 2002, scattered among unrelated files. Most people ignored them at first. Then someone noticed the title buried in the metadata, The Adam and Eve Story. For decades that phrase had lived only in rumor, whispered among fringe historians and survivalist circles. Now at last, the missing pages were visible, or at least parts of them. The content was stranger than anyone expected. Thomas's prose read like a scientist trying to describe an apocalypse in lab language. He outlined a planetary mechanism of rebalancing, a cycle repeating roughly every 6,500 years. In each round, as he told it, ice accumulation at the poles destabilizes Earth's rotation. When critical stress builds, the entire outer crust shifts around the molten core, realigning the continents in new positions. Oceans rush violently across the surface, erasing civilizations in hours. Then the poles refreeze, and humanity begins again. It wasn't just cataclysm, it was rhythm. Thomas described history as a heartbeat of destruction and renewal. He cataloged 6 previous cycles, assigning each to mythic accounts: Atlantis, the biblical flood, the fall of ancient Asian kingdoms. In his view, these weren't allegories, they were geological log entries recorded in religion. Every few thousand years, the planet hit reset. To mainstream science, it was nonsense. Physical crust displacement on that scale would require unimaginable energy. Yet the imagery felt vivid enough that even skeptics couldn't forget it. And buried among the metaphors were pieces that sounded disturbingly specific. Tables labeled magnetic transition interval. Coordinates marked current equatorial tension. Diagrams showing water engulfing what looked like the eastern seaboard of North America. Readers quickly began stitching the fragments together. On online forums, digital archivists compared Thomas's coordinates to modern coastlines. When geospatial software overlaid those lines on actual topographic maps, the results went viral. The projected flooding zones looked similar, uncannily so, to FEMA's high-risk flood boundaries and climate migration simulations drawn half a century later. That resemblance didn't prove anything, but it didn't need to. Coincidences this visual practically advertised themselves. One detail especially electrified researchers: Thomas's approximate timing. He claimed the last crustal shift ended 11,500 years ago, the same period geologists associate with the Younger Dryas, a global temperature crash that coincided with mass extinctions and bursts of meltwater flooding into the oceans. Scientists attribute that event to complex climate feedbacks. Thomas saw it as evidence of total planetary reorientation. The overlap was enough to reopen a door the CIA had never properly closed. As the declassified pages circulated, readers noticed tone shifts. Early chapters sounded quasi-scientific, filled with equations about centrifugal force. Later ones read like scripture. "The sun will rise again on a new equator," he wrote, "and survivors will remember the fire as the voice of God." That blend of cosmology and mysticism explained why the agency might have treated the book carefully. It was the sort of narrative that could blur science and prophecy in the public mind. But fascination rarely needs full proof. People wanted to believe the government knew more. Independent document restorers began applying image enhancement tools to the scans, revealing faint ghost text under the black blocks. Some claimed to read names of locations: Denver Basin, Tibetan Plateau, Pacific Compression Zone. Others argued those were artifacts of aging paper. To believers, though, these traces looked like a hidden atlas, places predicted to survive. Once those whispers took hold, a second wave of theorizing began. If the book was classified because it predicted real geological change, then the Pentagon must have used it as an internal reference. Suddenly, the 2018 leaked map labeled Geophysical Transition Zones wasn't just coincidence, it was continuity. Online sleuths overlaid Thomas's surviving world diagram onto the leaked image. The alignment of red-shaded regions astonished them. The same continental fragments, almost the same latitudes. Whether the resemblance came from creative speculation or deliberate modeling didn't matter. The visual story wrote itself. Document analysts pushed back hard. They pointed out that Thomas described instantaneous crustal displacement, while current geophysics only acknowledges magnetic reversals, slow, invisible, unfolding over millennia. His model ignored tectonic plates entirely. But outside the academic bubble, those distinctions blurred. When the magnetic poles drift faster every year, when satellite data show weakening field strength, the math of fear feels simple. Something's moving, and maybe he'd guessed the pattern first. The allure of the declassified pages is emotional as much as intellectual. They confirm that the question was once taken seriously by people in power. Even if the CIA only filed the book away out of bureaucratic habit, the very act of storage feels like agreement. Add to that the modern climate of uncertainty, rising seas, strange weather, government mistrust, and you have the perfect conditions for resurrection. Scroll through the surviving scans and one thing becomes clear. Thomas didn't just invent mythology, he curated it. He referenced over 100 flood legends from around the world, connecting each to specific continental regions. Mesopotamia, China, the Andes, different stories, same destruction. He called this the cycle of forgetfulness, claiming every civilization erases its predecessor's memory through disaster. In a subtle way, his book wasn't about geology at all. It was about amnesia, the recurring loss of knowledge after collapse. That theme resonated far beyond scientific debate. By the time modern readers rediscovered those pages, the text had transformed from pseudoscience into allegory for conspiracy itself. The redactions symbolize the portion of truth always kept out of reach. When you stare at them, you don't see censorship, you see promise, that behind every black bar lies confirmation of our suspicions. It's irresistible psychology, the very engine of 21st century paranoia. Yet there's another layer worth noticing. Hidden between the bold claims are brief, almost technical footnotes referring to geomagnetic reversal precursors. That term reappears later in legitimate scientific papers to describe magnetic field weakening before reversals. Whether coincidence or prescience, details like that lend an eerie echo of accuracy to fiction. Enough to make strategists curious, perhaps cautious. Enough to justify a quiet look, at least during the Cold War, when information alone could shift policy. So the declassified pages tell two stories at once. One is John Thomas's, the myth of repeating cataclysm dressed as science. The other is ours, the modern attempt to read warning into every omission. Somewhere between those two lies the reason his work refuses to die. Half a century after its suppression, the release didn't settle anything. It accelerated everything. Searches for crustal displacement tripled. Copies of the PDF were downloaded millions of times. And in the background, magnetic field readings showed measurable decline, the real kind scientists tracked daily. Fiction and fact had synchronized by accident. When the last missing chapters finally reached public databases, analysts noted a final passage quoting a line from Ecclesiastes. There is no new thing under the sun. For followers, that wasn't philosophy, it was physics. The planet had done this before, it would do it again. But what does actual evidence say about that claim? Is there any sign in real data that our magnetic field might be heading toward instability powerful enough to echo Thomas's predictions? To answer that, we have to leave speculation behind and step into modern geophysics, the arena where myth collides with measurable truth. The line between catastrophe and natural evolution sits there, buried in the core of the planet itself. Real science of magnetic reversal. Let's set superstition aside for a moment and ground the story in what we actually know. Earth's magnetic field isn't static, it flips. Sometimes slowly, sometimes unpredictably, but always by the same invisible engine churning in the planet's core. Liquid iron moving around the solid inner core creates a self-sustaining geodynamo, and every so often, that engine sputters and rewires itself. When it does, north becomes south and compasses would spin the wrong way, if humans had existed to see most of them happen. Over the last 160 million years, this reversal has repeated hundreds of times. The geological record preserves each one. Lava flows cool, minerals inside lock to the magnetic direction of that era, and later layers point the other way. It's like tree rings of polarity, bands of north and south alternating through stone. The last major flip in that pattern is known as the Bruns-Machiyama reversal. It happened roughly 786,000 years ago, confirmed by analysis of volcanic deposits in Hawaii, Italy, and the Atlantic seafloor. For most of history, scientists thought transitions like that took thousands of years. Then new data arrived suggesting one shift may have finished in less than a century, shockingly fast on a geological clock, but still gentle compared to anything in John Thomas's imagination. A related but smaller event, the Lost Champs excursion about 42,000 years ago, adds the fine print. It wasn't a full swap. The field briefly collapsed to a fraction of its usual strength. Magnetic north wandered almost to Antarctica, then bounced back. During that interval, cosmic ray bombardment. increased, ozone thinned, and some environmental disruptions appeared in the climate record. So while reversals aren't world-ending, the weakening phases around them can influence atmospheric chemistry and radiation exposure. For ancient humans navigating under the aurora, the sky would have glowed in places it never had before. Today, scientists are watching something that feels eerily familiar. The magnetic field's overall intensity is declining about 10 times faster than its long-term average. Over the South Atlantic, near Brazil, lies a patch of especially weak magnetism called the South Atlantic Anomaly. Satellites passing through it glitch from radiation bursts. The International Space Station routinely powers down instruments when it drifts overhead. This anomaly has doubled in size in the last 2 centuries, and nobody's quite sure why. That uncertainty fuels speculation. Are we witnessing the early tremor of a new reversal, or just a random wobble in an ancient system that never stays still for long? In laboratories, supercomputers simulate the flow of molten metal 2,900 kilometers beneath us. The models show chaotic convection patterns, heat differences between core and mantle stir loops of current that can weaken, split, or merge the main dipole field. Most runs predict temporary multipole states, with several norths and souths scattered around the globe before the magnetic lines settle again. These transitions don't rip continents apart. They simply scramble navigation and allow higher radiation at the surface. Compared to Thomas's planetary slippage, that's inconvenience, not apocalypse. Still, the word inconvenience undersells the modern stakes. The magnetic field is our shield against charged solar particles. If it weakens significantly, satellites suffer. Power grids experience geomagnetically induced currents that can fry transformers. High-altitude flights take greater radiation doses. Migratory species, birds, whales, even some bacteria, navigate through magnetic cues that could distort. Civilization wouldn't vanish, but technology-heavy society would face weeks or months of costly chaos. That's enough reason for governments to model worst-case outcomes, whether or not they expect crustal collapse. The data for magnetic drift are public and precise. Since 1831, the magnetic North Pole has moved from Canada's Arctic coast towards Siberia. At first it crept a few kilometers per year. Now it races more than 40. The speed alone isn't alarming, it's happened before, but combined with overall field weakening, it hints at instability in the geodynamo. Instruments aboard satellites like Swarm and Arsted chart that motion daily, feeding global models used for aviation, mapping, and military navigation. Every 5 years, those maps are recalibrated because magnetic coordinates literally age out of accuracy. When soldiers, pilots, and missiles rely on those numbers, governments take magnetic turbulence seriously. And that's where myth and defense policy start to intersect. A crustal shift may be fantasy, yet a magnetic one is measurable fact with real operational consequences. A communication blackout caused by solar activity during low field conditions could mimic the first hours of a cyber attack. Missile guidance systems relying on magnetic headings could fail simultaneously worldwide. From a strategic perspective, that's not science fiction, it's vulnerability. It's easy to see how a century of pole position studies morphs into contingency planning. Military analysts chart geophysical risk corridors, where field intensity changes fastest, largely for navigation correction and satellite safety. Out of context, those maps resemble the disaster projections circulating online. Flood zones? Probably not. Magnetic uncertainty zones? Definitely. When data leak without explanation, people fill in the blanks with prophecy. For geologists, reversals are signs of a healthy, dynamic planet. The field's constant movement dissipates heat from the core and maintains the geodynamo. Without it, we'd lose atmosphere like Mars. But for the rest of us, hearing that north might soon become south triggers an ancient fear, that the ground beneath us isn't permanent. Scientists assure us the process unfolds over thousands of years and leaves oceans where they are. Yet deep down, we crave drama, and history provides it. The rock record proves reversal, myth supplies destruction. Together they make sensation. The real question is timing. Statistical patterns don't predict an exact schedule. Some intervals between reversals last a few thousand years, others stretch 20 million. We live within one of those long pauses. Could another reversal start tomorrow? Possible. Could it take another 500,000 years? Equally plausible. What makes the current moment feel unique is speed, field decay, pole acceleration, and anomalies all trending faster than we've measured in modern times. Whether that curve continues or stabilizes, nobody knows. When government scientists brief policymakers, they frame it carefully. No sign of impending catastrophe, growing uncertainties to monitor. But imagine condensing decades of such data into a classified report titled Geophysical Transition Forecast. Strip out jargon, add risk colors on continental maps, and you'd have the perfect seed for misunderstanding. A map that looks like prophecy but is really maintenance. So yes, Earth's magnetic poles can and will reverse. The evidence is undeniable and majestic. But unlike the sudden rotational slip of folklore, this transformation happens in slow motion, over scales of civilization itself. The danger lies not in the physics but in the perception, how we react when science speaks a language that sounds apocalyptic. That brings us back to secrecy. If governments quietly prepare for the technological consequences of magnetic instability, doing so under classified projects may look exactly like hiding doomsday knowledge. And that perception feeds the same loop John Thomas started. Mystery creating myth, myth creating fear, fear demanding secrecy again. In the next part of the story, we'll see how that loop formed during the Cold War, when agencies began folding planetary science into national security planning, and the idea of a magnetic disaster found its way into Pentagon vocabulary. Cold War fears and Pentagon interest. To understand how the idea of a pole shift moved from dusty library shelves into the deepest files of the Pentagon, we have to return to the environment that made secrecy the default language of science, the Cold War. In those decades, every new discovery, no matter how abstract, came with a single question attached. Could this become a weapon or reveal a weakness? It didn't matter whether the subject was particle physics, weather control, or planetary motion. If it might influence war or survival, it belonged behind locked doors. So picture the United States in the mid-196s. Satellites newly orbiting, nuclear stockpiles expanding, and continental defense planners drawing up survival blueprints for every imaginable nightmare. They modeled nuclear winters, asteroid impacts, pandemics, and even sudden geophysical disasters. The goal wasn't academic curiosity, it was continuity of government. How do you preserve command if the surface itself becomes hostile? Within that atmosphere, Hapgood's and Thomas's ideas slipped naturally into discussion. The phrase Earth crust displacement appeared in the same breath as planetary resilience. To a strategist, both posed the same logistical puzzle: relocation, communication, reconstruction. If Earth could theoretically shift its outer shell, even if the odds were 1 in a million, the military wanted a file on it. The newly formed Defense Civil Preparedness Agency kept shelves of low probability, total impact scenarios. Sources from the era mention global destabilization models, a phrase broad enough to cover nuclear and natural catastrophe alike. Funding for studies followed an unusual path, through defense-related universities and think tanks that specialized in systems analysis. Rand, MITRE, and the Lincoln Laboratory all hosted research on atmospheric and magnetic phenomena, officially tied to missile navigation. Yet buried in progress memos are references to geomagnetic anomalies and polar drift compensation. The context was guidance systems, but documents often strayed into speculation about large-scale magnetic variation and its long-term consequences. Whether that curiosity led anyone to evaluate pole shift hypotheses directly is uncertain, though later CIA files indicate at least peripheral awareness. Then there were the underground complexes, literal layers of secrecy built into mountainsides. As superpower tensions rose, U.S. agencies designed bunkers like NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain to withstand nuclear assault and natural upheaval alike. Internal memos from the 197s classified these spaces under continuity of operations plans, referencing not just blast tolerance but geophysical integrity. It's bureaucratic phrasing, but some historians believe it includes contingencies for earthquakes, crustal stress, and mass landform change. In simple terms, if the planet shakes, command must still function. To an outsider decades later, that language sounds hauntingly similar to Thomas's descriptions of continental catastrophe. The crossover between catastrophe theory and military engineering wasn't unique to America. The Soviet Union ran its own studies under geophysical warfare programs, investigating whether nuclear detonations could trigger seismic or atmospheric disturbances. Western analysts read those reports with alarm, sparking reciprocal research to understand any natural instability that could be weaponized or blamed during crisis. By the late 197s, phrases like geodynamic response modeling appeared in NATO technical glossaries. Most of it focused on earthquake prediction, but once again, the vocabulary overlapped with the lexicon of speculative catastrophism. It's easy to see how those coincidences hardened into legend. When obscure scientific terms surface in defense budgets, curiosity explodes. In 1981, a declassified memo from the Federal Emergency Management Agency mentioned national relocation contingencies in the event of continental reconfiguration. The phrase almost certainly referred to nuclear fallout zones, but the wording fueled rumor that someone inside FEMA was quietly preparing for a physical shift of the continents. Archivists would later show that the continental reconfiguration map attached was a simple thermal blast outline, but imagination rarely waits for context. Meanwhile, the era's fascination with planetary threat deepened through public propaganda. Films, government pamphlets, even classroom drills taught citizens to seek shelter from radiation or environmental collapse. Those same years saw NASA's planetary defense initiatives quietly coordinate with the Department of Defense over asteroid detection. Outwardly, it looked like space science. Inwardly, it was survival strategy. To planners conditioned by worst-case logic, the difference between an asteroid impact and a pole shift was scale, not category. Both could end civilization overnight. During the late Cold War, the phrase global cataclysm scenarios appeared repeatedly within Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency archives, linked to environmental monitoring satellites. Officially, these networks tracked weather for military logistics. Unofficially, they fed data into simulations exploring how atmospheric or magnetic disturbances could impact weapon guidance, communication, and early warning systems. Those simulations required comprehensive topographic inputs, the same kind of data later seen in the leaked Pentagon map. Whether coincidence or inheritance, the resemblance is uncanny. Rumors of CIA involvement with unorthodox geoscience peaked in the 197s when reports surfaced about Project Stargate's psychic experiments. Though unrelated to geology, that program reinforced the image of intelligence agencies chasing esoteric knowledge. Against that backdrop, the classification of the atom and Eve's story seemed less bizarre. If analysts were probing extrasensory perception, why not evaluate catastrophic Earth physics too? Declassification requests decades later confirmed the agency had indeed filed the book, but disclosed nothing about internal commentary, only that it was stored under Earth science assessments. Some declassified FEMA briefings from the 198s reveal sections titled Geophysical Contingency Response. The wording describes emergency response to large-scale geological change. While most scholars interpret this as earthquake or volcanic events, the absence of precise definitions left wide interpretive margins. One file dated 1983 lists polar regions as priority data zones for monitoring gravitational anomalies. To conspiracy circles today, that single phrase is taken as proof of secret magnetic pole tracking decades before current disclosures. To historians, it's routine geodesy repackaged by speculation. Still, genuine military motive existed behind that monitoring. Submarine fleets navigated through magnetic maps, and missile trajectories depended on predictable field behavior. Even marginal shifts demanded recalibration. A failure to update guidance data could mean targeting errors stretching hundreds of miles. For strategic command, that weakness was unacceptable. As technology advanced, so did the need for continuous geomagnetic observation, and with it, increasingly classified documentation of Earth's magnetic state. That's the subtle truth hiding beneath Cold War paranoia. The Pentagon wasn't preparing for mythic judgment, it was protecting electronics. But from the outside, secrecy looks identical regardless of reason. Tell the public you're running Operation Magnetic Contingency Analysis, and no amount of context will convince them it's about navigation instead of apocalypse. By the end of the 198s, catastrophe studies had evolved into risk assessment handbooks distributed within civil defense agencies. Terms like Event X, a generic placeholder for global disruption, appeared in interagency planning exercises. Whether Event X referred to nuclear exchange, solar flare, or geophysical anomaly was left intentionally ambiguous. Ambiguity kept reports flexible and mysteries alive. When the Berlin Wall fell and archives began to open, researchers found that many supposedly prophetic plans were simply repurposed defense logistics. Evacuation corridors meant for nuclear refugees doubled later as templates for hurricane response. Yet their cryptic naming conventions, Zone Delta, Sector Z1, mirror those still visible on the leaked Pentagon map today. Coincidence, continuity, or deliberate recycling, it perpetuates the illusion of hidden foresight. In retrospect, the Cold War's obsession with preparedness fused myth and analysis into one bureaucratic ritual. Plan for everything, disclose nothing. Agencies weren't studying pole shifts because they believed in Thomas's visions. They studied them because ignoring any scenario, however absurd, contradicted the mandate of survival. Yet through that caution, the government accidentally scripted the very conspiracy culture that thrives now. Every black file stamped geophysical feels like confirmation that someone already knows the end of the world's schedule. As the decades advanced and magnetic research grew genuinely sophisticated, the infrastructure built for nuclear survival found new use tracking natural risk. Satellite arrays once tuned to detect missile plumes now measure field variation. Cold War technology never disappeared, it mutated, quietly keeping watch on a planet that never stops moving. So when modern observers uncover traces of geophysical transition planning, they're glimpsing the afterimage of 50 years of anxiety. What began as nuclear defense evolved into planetary vigilance. Whether born of science, paranoia, or both, the Pentagon's interest in Earth's instability is an inheritance from that age, a lingering reflex that equates classification with control. And by the early 21st century, that reflex would resurface in a new form. Global preparedness protocols designed not against an enemy, but against nature itself. Modern catastrophe preparedness. By 2025, the machinery of global disaster response looks exhausted. Decades of overlapping crises, pandemics, climate shocks, cyber attacks, have turned emergency management into a permanent state of triage. In the United States, those strains show most clearly inside FEMA. The agency's disaster relief fund is nearly empty, forcing what's called an immediate needs posture. Aid goes only to rescue and life-saving missions. Reimbursements to states and cities are delayed or denied altogether. Between July and September 2025, FEMA went 51 days without processing new disaster declarations, even as the Midwest drowned under record floods. Local officials didn't wait for Washington to wake up. They activated National Guard units on their own. That pattern defines the new era, local first, federal maybe. A political blueprint called Project 2025 codifies the shift. Its writers argue that disaster relief has made states complacent, so they propose higher thresholds for federal declarations and a drastic cut in cost sharing. Under the plan, states must shoulder up to 75% of recovery bills themselves. The federal share falls to 25%. In theory, that builds resilience. In practice, it means smaller towns can't afford to rebuild. Mitigation grants vanish, including the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program that once funded levees and wildfire defenses. $3.5 billion frozen overnight. Privatization fills the gap. The National Flood Insurance Program, long criticized for subsidizing risky coastal development, is being wound down, replaced by private carriers who insure only profitable areas. Millions of homeowners in flood-prone zones are left uninsured. Federal analysts admit it's a deterrent disguised as reform. If coverage disappears, people won't rebuild in danger zones. Yet it also pushes migration inland, quiet, unacknowledged movement from coasts toward what documents call resilient corridors. That phrase echoes language seen on the leaked Pentagon map. A broad, similar retrenchment plays out through diplomacy rather than austerity. The Geneva Accord for Global De-Escalation, signed by more than 70 nations in 2025, commits militaries to reduce spending on weapons and redirect it toward humanitarian and climate response. Officially, it's about peace. Unofficially, it's about economies preparing for multi-hazard collapse. You can track the pivot in budgets, less on offense, more on logistics. Armies are laying runways for evacuation rather than invasion. Behind these policies sits a new phrase repeated in UN and Pentagon memos alike: interconnected disaster risk. It means single events no longer stay single. A flood knocks out a power grid that cripples hospitals during a heat wave that collapses internet infrastructure. Everything cascades. The United Nations University's 2025 report calls this the age of compounding crises, warning that systemic breakdown is statistically inevitable without cross-sector coordination. Military planners translate that into doctrine. disasters are battlefields without enemies. Inside the U.S. defense structure, new manuals titled Catastrophic Incident Annexes outline how armed forces support civilian response when civil authority falters. These aren't conventional martial law blueprints. They're logistical, helicopter networks, modular hospitals, mobile desalination, emergency communications. Command falls under U.S. Northern Command, coordinating with the Army Corps of Engineers and National Guard. During pandemic testing drills, those annexes ran under the codename Resilient Shield. One clause integrates geophysical threat assessment, language broad enough to cover earthquakes, volcanic events, and, though never stated, magnetic disruptions that could scramble global navigation. The logic isn't hard to see. Every defense system, from missile guidance to satellite communications, depends on predictable magnetic data. If field instability grows, response time to natural disasters becomes a matter of national security. Quietly, continuity of government programs now includes space weather contingencies, meaning geomagnetic storms and field decays are treated the same as cyber attacks. Classified briefing slides categorize them as global catastrophic hazards, the same term once used for nuclear exchange. Across the Atlantic, European militaries blend civil protection with defense duties under the Total Resilience Framework. Soldiers build flood barriers on the Rhine 1 month, then manage wildfire command posts in Spain the next. Their internal studies discuss how population displacement could exceed World War II levels during a compound climate infrastructure collapse. For planners hardened by probabilities, that's no longer science fiction, it's actuarial math. Meanwhile, local communities are told to prepare for prolonged federal absence. Hospitals, utilities, and municipalities coordinate directly with regional bases rather than distant Washington offices. Volunteer brigades train with National Guard logistics officers. The line between civilian and military relief blurs until it's practically invisible. Officials swear it's efficiency, not militarization, but locals notice. More camouflage uniforms at disaster briefings, more convoys pre-positioned before storms. Underneath official optimism, anxiety hums. Analysts at the Global Governance Forum compile yearly Catastrophic Risk Index rankings. The 2025 edition shows Nordic countries safest, conflict states least, but the mid-tier nations, from the US to Japan, are slipping. Resource exhaustion, aging infrastructure, political fragmentation. The report warns that delayed federal response functions as systemic decay indicator. That phrase is bureaucratic for the system's too slow to save itself. So when critics suspect hidden motives, when they ask whether all this decentralization masks knowledge of an impending event, they're responding to real signals. Shrinking federal capacity, growing military logistics, data categorized as geophysical. Even if no one inside government believes in Thomas's catastrophic pole shift, the structure now resembles preparation for one. A network of distributed self-reliance, regional hubs, and relocation corridors mirrors exactly the architecture a global catastrophe scenario would require. From the outside, it feels coordinated. On paper, it's just prudent adaptation. But secrecy seals the perception loop. When FEMA delays announcements to prevent market panic, or when defense agencies run unpublicized drills simulating satellite failure, civilians glimpse fragments, maps with red zones, transport plans labeled only by letter, and imagine apocalypse logistics. In the age of leaks, restraint looks like concealment. The irony is brutal. Trying to prevent panic creates the very fear planners dread. Every withheld chart resurrects the ghosts of the CIA's old redactions. Online analysts overlay new relief zone maps atop John Thomas diagrams and swear the government finally admitted the cycle's real. Officials insist it's coincidence, the byproduct of geography and prudence. But coincidences repeat too perfectly, and patterns are contagious. Today's global preparedness model may be the rational response to climate volatility and resource strain, or it may be interpreted, inevitably, as rehearsal for planetary crisis. Either way, nations are converging on the same principle once whispered by Cold War survivalists. Assume isolation, plan for total systems failure. Look around and the signs stack up: decentralized power grids, redundant communication satellites, regional food depots, floating hospitals, underground data archives carved into mountains. Whether born of science or superstition, the world is quietly designing itself to survive without help. And amid that silent restructuring, a curious pattern emerges. Many infrastructure upgrades track directly along the high-latitude corridors where the magnetic field is changing fastest. Officially, it's coincidence. Strategically, it's caution. To conspiracy forums, it's confirmation that governments are positioning for a magnetic transition. In truth, nobody outside top clearance levels can say what drives each line item in the budget. But history tells us one thing: secrecy combined with visible preparation always breeds myth. The same logic that once hid the Adam and Eve story now hides in supply contracts and resilience grants. When everything is justified as prevention, every prevention looks like prophecy. That's the landscape of 2025, an age where catastrophe planning has become civilization's common language, and yet the translation divides us further. Some see wise governance, others a rehearsal for extinction. Both perspectives might be right, depending on what tomorrow brings. And in that uncertainty, whispers begin spreading through the very institutions building this resilient future. Stories that inside certain Pentagon labs, scientists studying UAP propulsion are working side by side with geophysicists tracking magnetic flux. A strange partnership no one can publicly explain. 770 words, the whistleblowers and the UAP connection. It started not with scientists, but with soldiers. In 2024 and 2025, a group of current and former military personnel did something their predecessors never dared. They spoke under oath about encounters their commanders had told them to forget. One by one, they described unidentified anomalous phenomena, UAPs, objects defying physics, shutting down electronics, and vanishing from radar as if gravity itself had glitched. The hearings made headlines for the aliens, but the deeper story hid beneath the surface. Each witness carried a second, quieter message: the retaliation. Careers ruined, clearances revoked, reputations shredded for filing routine incident reports. The Pentagon dismissed their accounts as misidentified technology, yet investigators noticed a pattern. The locations of those sightings lined up with regions of magnetic turbulence tracked by defense satellites, zones identical to the ones shaded red on that alleged geophysical transition map. Take Dylan Borland, an Air Force veteran who swore he'd seen a triangular craft hover silently above Langley Air Force Base back in 2012. When it appeared, flight electronics blinked out. Compass needles spun. Within seconds, the object accelerated straight upward. No sonic boom, no exhaust. He reported it, expecting debrief. Instead, he says, he was removed from duty and his security clearance mysteriously reevaluated. Years later, when Congress asked him to testify, he described feeling the air pressure change, like the field itself had been inverted. That phrase sparked curiosity in physics circles. It resembled jargon from electromagnetic containment research. Then came Alexandro Wiggins, a Navy senior chief still on active duty, who broke rank to detail an encounter aboard the USS Jackson in 2023. His crew tracked a luminous sphere maneuvering underwater at 70 knots, turning sharper than any submersible could survive. Magnetic anomaly sensors spiked off scale. A week later, classified maintenance orders replaced key detection hardware. Official logs vanished from the data server. Wiggins's appearance before Congress, the first by an active duty sailor on UAPs, cracked open a silence held for decades. And finally, Jeffrey Nuxatelli, former Air Force military police at Vandenberg, recounted a series of incidents from 2003 to 2005, multiple witnesses, stationary lights over launch complexes, patterns repeating nightly until command instructed them to stop reporting. The claim wasn't new. What mattered was corroboration. Hand-drawn maps from his reports matched historical flight restrictions later imposed for magnetic calibration operations. To oversight committees that looked suspiciously coordinated. The official Pentagon body assigned to sort the chaos, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, or ARO, publicly insists there's no verifiable evidence of non-human technology. Yet its own data show nearly every major UAP incident clustering around magnetic irregularities, zones where the field twists or thins. Scientists label them natural distortions. Strategists call them blind sectors in Earth's magnetic defense bubble. Between those views lives an uncomfortable possibility. The objects and the anomalies may be interacting with the same invisible current. That realization sparked what insiders now call the magnetic connection, the idea that UAP propulsion and magnetic instability are entwined. The same distortions that scramble radar could provide lift or suppression fields. If that's true, studying one automatically exposes secrets of the other. In other words, the Pentagon's UAP research and its magnetic field monitoring might actually be two branches of a single classified project. Former contractors hint that such cross-disciplinary analysis already happens under code names disguised as environmental projects. A retired systems engineer told investigative journalists that his team at a defense lab near Albuquerque analyzed transient magnetic distortions captured by radar arrays during auroral events. Officially, the study related to satellite reliability. Unofficially, the timestamps aligned with public UAP sighting reports. When the lab's funding abruptly moved to an unacknowledged budget line marked Core Field Dynamics, staff received non-disclosure extensions typically reserved for intelligence programs, not atmospheric science. To outside observers, it sounds like conspiracy mathematics: connect enough coincidences, and the lines eventually meet. But context keeps changing. In 2025, the same year whistleblowers testified, the U.S. Air Force awarded a contract for electromagnetic environment stability assessment. Buried on page 63 of that notice sits a phrase that raised eyebrows: assess correlations between anomalous aerial signatures and geomagnetic field perturbations. For researchers following the pole shift narrative, that single sentence reads like revelation. Legislators demand transparency. The Pentagon insists on national security. The result is stalemate wrapped in rumor. Publicly, ARO attributes every anomaly to drones, weather, or misperception. Privately, sources describe genuine worry about systemic interference, meaning something unknown is coupling with Earth's magnetic architecture. Even if the culprit is purely terrestrial, that interaction could disable missile guidance and satellite orientation. So the military treats UAP study not as fringe fascination, but as risk management. And risk management lives inside the same vaults that house geophysical contingency plans. Here's where narratives collide. John Thomas warned that sudden magnetic realignment could spawn devastation. Today's insiders fear smaller, localized distortions, capable of downing fleets. To them, pole instability isn't cosmic prophecy, it's operational hazard. Still, the symbolism is impossible to ignore. Invisible forces shifting beneath our technology, just as secrecy shifts beneath democracy. Some staffers within Congress privately admit that UAP oversight committees now include briefings from geoscientists, not ufologists. Their task is to determine whether the phenomena reflect energy interactions within Earth's field rather than extraterrestrial craft. When asked why those meetings remain closed, one aide offered a cryptic phrase: because if the field itself is fluctuating, that's infrastructure. The most provocative speculation suggests that UAP secrecy doubles as camouflage for classified geoengineering research. By framing certain atmospheric experiments as pursuit of unidentified phenomena, agencies can hide large-scale electromagnetodynamic tests without public panic. If you're trying to stabilize communication grids against magnetic drift, what better cover than a program already associated with unidentified lights in the sky? Whether that's true or a paranoid simplification, it explains why those two worlds, UAP and geophysics, now orbit each other so tightly. Journalists chasing leaks discovered overlapping personnel lists between defense laboratories studying propulsion anomalies and those managing space weather simulations. The same physicists appear on both projects, sometimes weeks apart. One internal slide deck, obtained through a Freedom of Information delay, references Field Integrity Program, Phase 3. The description: continuation of magnetodynamic research relevant to aerial and orbital stability systems. Nowhere does it say UAP, but the timing matches months when sightings spiked over test ranges. For the whistleblowers, these coincidences reinforce belief that the government knows far more than it admits. Not about aliens, but about something happening to the planet itself. Borland said it plainly to lawmakers: whatever that craft was doing, it reacted to the field like the atmosphere bent for it. If we don't understand that, maybe nothing we build will stay in the sky when the shift comes. His tone mixed awe and warning, the same mix that echoes through Thomas's forgotten pages. Meanwhile, ARO grids its reports with meticulous caution. No credible evidence of non-human origin, the director repeats. Yet the office simultaneously lobbies for magnetometer arrays around naval installations, citing environmental characterization. It's bureaucratic code for mapping local magnetic drift. Exactly the data you'd need to verify whether the intermediary field between crust and core is weakening unevenly. That brings us back to the Pentagon itself, and to the whispers about a document hidden on secure servers. A topographic map drawn from simulations uniting UAP telemetry with magnetic field instability models. Several insiders call it the Geotrans overlay. Others know it as whatever leaked in 2018. The picture of continents distorted, corridors marked for relocation, oceans trespassing onto familiar ground. Publicly, the agency calls the artifact a hoax. Privately, nobody dares destroy it. If the map truly exists, it might not be predicting divine retribution or cosmic reversal. It might be pure defense analytics, built from cross-referenced UAP and magnetic data to forecast navigation failure zones during extreme solar events. But through the lens of secrecy, that technical exercise becomes apocalypse cartography, a chart of the Earth we're quietly afraid to admit is changing. So when you hear whistleblowers describe machines that twist gravity and defy compass readings, remember the backdrop. The same Pentagon that downplays aliens is also modeling field fluctuations that could unravel global positioning. The two subjects share the same magnetic heartbeat, and somewhere within that entanglement, between silence and survival, science and speculation, a digital map waits, stamped Geophysical Transition Zones. Its existence remains denied, its coordinates debated. Yet everyone who's seen even fragments agrees on one thing. It doesn't look like fiction drawn by a dreamer. It looks like planning. The secret map leak. The leak didn't explode onto social media. It unfolded like digital fog, creeping from one forgotten forum to another. Late one night, users on a closed contractor message board discovered a post from an anonymous account created minutes earlier. Attached was a low-resolution scan labeled Geophysical Transition Zones, classified projection. The attachment vanished within an hour, but not before several members mirrored it to encrypted storage. What sat inside the file looked like a reshaped world. The map resembled standard topography at first glance, latitude and longitude grid, familiar coastlines, but certain contours looked wrong. The eastern seaboard of North America had retreated westward. The Mediterranean was no longer an enclosed sea, but a wide estuary opening into the Sahara. Australia's center gleamed bright blue, as if an inland ocean had filled it. Thin gray lines snaked across the continents, annotated only by numbers and arrows. Along their margins read a strange legend: primary relocation corridors 1 to 12. The account's accompanying message was shorter than a tweet. Derived from classified core field instability model revision, C/do not circulate. No source, no date, no verification, just that warning. Yet the document metadata pointed to an origin inside a Pentagon geospatial server cluster. Analysts traced the internal code, magshift_PJ34A, identical to a tag once embedded in a set of magnetic anomaly studies declassified decades earlier. That coincidence triggered a chain reaction across leak analysis communities. Within hours, researchers overlaid the new image atop existing climate migration simulations. To their surprise, the red hazard zones aligned almost perfectly with FEMA's unpublished worst-case flood projections, data intended to estimate coastal loss under combined sea level rise and polar ice collapse. But the differences were what caught attention. Where FEMA's map showed gradual encroachment, this one displayed abrupt boundaries, as if shorelines had jumped hundreds of miles overnight. That abruptness echoed Sean Thomas's portrayal of an instant crustal slip, oceans vaulting over continents. For seasoned analysts, similarities can mean one of three things: shared data sets, deliberate forgery, or common physics. Supporters of authenticity favored the third. They argued that if both FEMA and defense simulations used magnetic field variables, pattern overlap was inevitable. Skeptics leaned toward the second, noting that anyone with moderate GIS skills could blend NASA elevation layers with Thomas's diagrams and create the same effect. Yet nobody could explain why the map's coordinate grid matched Defense Mapping Agency formatting abandoned in the 199s. Journalists attempted verification through anonymous defense sources. Most received careful denials, no knowledge of such a projection. But one retired analyst admitted he'd seen internal models titled Geophysical Transition Scenarios used in post-impact disaster drills. They weren't prophecies, he explained, just algorithms testing global logistics under extreme pole migration. Yet even that concession kept the story alive. If those models existed, someone had the authority to craft maps from them, classified or not. Within weeks of the leak, independent cartographers dissected every pixel. Subtle compression artifacts suggested repeated scanning. meaning the original was likely physical, not digital. Under contrast adjustment, faint embossed seals appeared along the border. Though unreadable, their layout resembled the stamp placement used on restricted DoD documents. The more skeptics tried to prove forgery, the more details seemed to validate its authenticity. The file's internal note layer was harder to dismiss. Hidden text strings included the phrase "See Annex C, Polar Velocity Model." That annex didn't exist publicly, but declassified Air Force geodesy papers from 2008 referenced a Polar Velocity Model C, studying differential rotation near the core mantle boundary. To coincidence chasers, the connection was irresistible. To historians, it suggested the map might originate from that project, an innocent scientific diagram reinterpreted through fear. Still, the emotional response overshadowed technical nuance. In online videos, commentators traced the red zones with trembling voices. The subcontinent submerged, Alaska shattered into islands, Europe's lowlands dissolved. They played side-by-side animations, comparing Thomas's ancient cataclysm timeline to this modern leak, pausing on the shared latitudes of devastation. The visual echo was hypnotic. One map drawn by a mystic engineer in 1966, one alleged Pentagon projection from half a century later, each predicting the same drowned world. Government silence sealed perception. Pentagon spokespersons dismissed questions, calling the leak unverified material from non-official sources. They never said fake. In the vocabulary of secrecy, that single omission was enough. If it truly were nonsense, why not call it that outright? Because national security rules forbid commenting on any document marked classified, genuine or otherwise. Ironically, denial by omission implied validation. Skeptics countered with digital forensics breakdowns. They highlighted inconsistent font spacing, pixel edges around the legend suggesting composite editing. But even those analyses couldn't clarify why coordinate overlays corresponded precisely to modern data sets unavailable to civilians in 2018 when the file first surfaced publicly. Either the creator had inside access, or the Pentagon really had commissioned a study that never left secure servers. Then came the oddest coincidence of all. In 2024, FEMA released an internal training module titled National Relocation Corridor Framework. Its primary diagrams reused identical numbering, corridors 1 through 12, as the leaked map. Officially, those labels referred to interstate evacuation routes prepared for massive coastal displacement due to hurricanes and sea level rise. But for believers, it served as smoking gun. The government had operationalized the same relocation corridors, once marked as survival paths on the forbidden projection. Within online communities, side-by-side comparisons spread faster than any denial. Others noticed that portions of the map's red overlays corresponded not merely to coastlines, but to known magnetic anomaly belts, the same regions of rapid field drift measured by European Space Agency satellites. Greenland, Siberia, and the South Atlantic apex all shimmered within the projected disaster zones. Statistically, that alignment could be coincidence, yet to storytellers it looked like confession. The map wasn't predicting floods, it was delineating magnetic instability. If that hypothesis holds, the relocation corridors might represent zones optimized for communications and navigation stability, areas least affected when field intensity drops. In simpler terms, safe signal paths. From a defense perspective, that matters more than sinking cities. Strategic command requires reliable guidance. During a severe magnetic event, regions near field nulls could become black holes for positioning systems. Mapping those in advance would be essential, and potentially classified. Viewed through that lens, the map transforms from apocalyptic to practical, a contingency blueprint for maintaining governance when geography itself interferes with electronics. Yet mythology resists the motion. Once the public sees a red-shaded continent, no caption can convince them it's merely an exercise. The mind reads doom. Inside think tank circles, a few analysts frame the leak differently. To them, the map isn't a prophecy at all, but a strategic vulnerability model. Climate, magnetic drift, population density, and infrastructure layered together to expose weak points. Overlay enough variables, and red zones form where failure cascades quickest. Floodplains coincide with magnetic weak spots. Communication hubs cross seismic belts. It's probability math disguised as apocalypse. Once stripped of its legend and leaked online, that model evolved into the very panic it was meant to preempt. Speculation didn't stop there. Some claim the image originated from an AI-driven simulation commissioned by a defense contractor, a demonstration that escaped NDAs. Others whisper about a black project called Erebus, combining solar storm and magnetic field failure tests. None of it is proven, but the story persists because every name gives shape to the one certainty everyone shares. The map looks like preparation. In hindsight, authenticity almost doesn't matter. The map functions as mirror. It reflects every fear incubated since Thomas's pages faded under CIA ink. That somewhere, powerful institutions hold knowledge of an approaching transformation and choose silence. When people look at those distorted coastlines, they recognize not just rising seas or magnetic drift, but the limits of trust. What nobody can dispute is its timing. The leak appeared precisely as governments pivoted to local control, and the magnetic north accelerated toward Siberia at record speed. Probability met paranoia and fused. Whether coincidence or coordination, the synchronicity ensured permanence. Once the internet assigns meaning to an image, it never forgets. Today, the Geophysical Transition Zones map circulates in countless variations, color-corrected, vector-traced, animated into predictions for 203 and beyond. Fact-checkers debunk it monthly, believers restore it nightly. It's become the digital heir to the Adam and Eve story, repackaged in pixels instead of paper. Some call it blueprint, others psyop, others still the accidental disclosure of the Pentagon's quiet admission that Earth itself is entering a magnetic adolescence. Maybe it's all three, a warning, a hoax, and a reflection of what secrecy does to imagination. Whether drawn by a defense analyst or an online trickster, the lines on that map have already altered history. They've convinced millions that the government keeps a schedule for the next Earth. And perhaps that's the real story, not the map's predictions, but our reaction to them. We annotate, extrapolate, and repost because we crave control over forces we don't understand. The classified projection gives us a shape to our unease, even if the continents on it never move an inch. Section 9. Evidence of magnetic drift and military tracking. By now, scientists agree on one basic fact. Earth's magnetic poles are restless. They wander, accelerate, stall, and sometimes reverse completely. But in the last century, that wandering has entered overdrive. The magnetic North Pole, once rooted near Canada's Arctic islands, is now sprinting towards Siberia at nearly 40 kilometers per year, a pace never recorded before. This isn't a minor quirk of geology. It's a measurable phenomenon tracked by satellites, aircraft, and submarines across multiple nations. Magnetic observatories from Alaska to Norway plot the shift daily. The data show a consistent eastward march, followed by acceleration in the 199s when core flow beneath the Arctic seemingly streamlined. Nobody knows why it happens so fast. The dynamic is buried nearly 3,000 kilometers down, where molten iron moves like the currents of a planetary ocean. Any change in that flow alters the poles above, a butterfly effect in metal and magnetism. For pilots and navigators, it's more than curiosity, it's recalibration hell. Every modern aircraft, ship, and missile guidance system depends on magnetic reference models. The World Magnetic Model, WMM, updated every 5 years by US and UK agencies, forms the invisible grid behind GPS correction and compass alignment. In 2018, the field began drifting so quickly that scientists had to issue an emergency update 2 years early. Maps literally went out of date halfway through their lifespan. The cause? The North's leap toward Russia had accelerated beyond forecast. At that same time, defense contractors received new protocols for magnetic variance correction. Unclassified memos advised recalibrating drone systems, underwater sensors, and long-range radar arrays more frequently. It looked mundane on paper, but internal notes linked the update to core dynamics uncertainty. In non-bureaucratic language, that means nobody could guarantee the field would behave tomorrow the way it did today. The military pays attention to that uncertainty because navigation is warfare's nervous system. Submarines cruise beneath oceans relying on magnetic maps when satellites can't reach. Missiles lock their inertial paths to geomagnetic references as backups for GPS. Even ground troops use calibrated compasses when electronic guidance fails. A small drift in magnetic north can translate to hundreds of meters of error across long distances, a nightmare when accuracy decides survival. Hence the quiet obsession inside defense research labs with tracking the poles down to fractions of a degree. Satellite constellations like the European Space Agency's Swarm mission and the US NOAA's DSMP satellites feed real-time magnetic data into Pentagon servers. The information updates simulation platforms that predict not only where the poles are, but where they might suddenly speed up or slow down. These aren't secret because they're apocalyptic, they're secret because they expose strategic vulnerability. If foreign actors know exactly where navigation precision breaks down, they know how to blind systems during conflict. But secrecy breeds pattern hunters. When the public sees classified Geophysical Transition Zone charts overlapping with regions of fast magnetic change, the leap to disaster mapping feels natural. To engineers, it's maintenance. To conspiracy theorists, it's prophecy repackaged as protocol. Magnetic drift isn't uniform, it's surprisingly lopsided. The south magnetic pole hardly budges compared to the north. Meanwhile, mid-latitude anomalies intensify, especially over South America and Southern Africa, where the field weakens fastest. That weak patch, known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, already knocks out satellite memory units every few months. The International Space Station powers down sensors when crossing it to avoid radiation surges. If the area continues to expand, low-orbit infrastructure could experience communication outages stretching across continents. Here's where things merge with high-level defense planning. Quietly published procurement lists show contracts for magnetic anomaly monitoring networks stationed across the South Atlantic, Indian Ocean, and Arctic. The official reason is to improve navigation safety. Unofficially, those locations form a triangle enclosing the planet's largest zones of field instability. The network's data pipeline terminates at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado, home of North American Defense Command. If the goal were simply scientific, NASA could handle it. Military coordination implies strategic importance. The fascination runs deeper than guidance systems. Communication reliability, satellite drag calculations, even underground pipeline corrosion rates depend on field intensity. The armed forces classify any factor that can cripple such infrastructure as a domain vulnerability. Hence the classified tag seen on leaked files, Magshift PJ0034A, interpreted by researchers as magnetic shift projection. Whether that's true or merely archival shorthand, the intersection between physics and strategy is undeniable. Skeptics argue that reading Catastrophe into these programs confuses caution for conspiracy. They're right partly. Magnetic fields fluctuate naturally. The current weakening might plateau. Yet internal task force briefings obtained through Freedom of Information requests reveal phrases like anticipate increased spatial variability and assess thresholds for field collapse event modeling. Those aren't the words of calm observers. They're the language of contingency planners. If you were designing global defense protocols and learned that the compass of your planet could wander at unpredictable speed, you'd start modeling extremes too. Not to forecast doomsday, but to ensure satellites, missiles, and communication grids don't fail simultaneously when the field dips. From there, it's a short, possibly fatal leap to misunderstanding. A contour showing zone delta, high flux instability risk, sounds innocent to geophysicists. Online, it becomes a region marked for annihilation. Even the logistics of updating navigation illustrate how vital this monitoring has become. The World Magnetic Model 2025, scheduled for release at the end of that year, was delayed twice due to erratic data. Interim fixes were quietly distributed to defense navigators under confidential annexes. Public versions appeared later, stripped of certain coefficients relating to high-latitude accelerations. The omission might be procedural. It also might reflect classified confidence limits the military isn't prepared to disclose. To civilians reading the open report, the missing parameters look like intentional secrecy over impending changes. So what would impact thresholds actually mean? In practice, planners test how rapidly systems fail as the field weakens. When magnetic shielding drops below a certain Gauss level, satellites accumulate radiation damage faster. Atmospheric drag alters orbit, communication blackouts compound. At ground level, geomagnetically induced currents surge through power transmissions. Continental blackouts become possible, in hours, not months. That's why agencies like U.S. Northern Command and FEMA now include geomagnetic storms under catastrophic event planning. The same data that underpin scientific journals feed directly into risk assessments labeled national security sensitive. There's another point most people overlook. These magnetic maps double as early warning tools for UAP detection. Remember those whistleblower accounts of craft interacting with localized field distortions? Tracking regional drift gives analysts baselines. Anything deviating from expected patterns triggers secondary investigation. In a feedback loop of secrecy, studying the planet becomes indistinguishable from monitoring objects above it. To policy outsiders, that blending fuels every theory imaginable, from alien tech interference to imminent crustal slip. The irony is that magnetic drift itself is slow, patient, almost elegant. It reshapes no continents, unleashes no instant floods. What it does threaten is coordination, the invisible lattice that keeps modern civilization synchronized. When scientists brief officials about pole migration, they emphasize resilience, update the models, recalibrate, carry on. But bureaucracies built on control instincts translate uncertainty into classification. That reflex, protect to prevent chaos, becomes the seed of myth. Every time a dataset leaves the public release schedule for review, the imagination fills the blank space with apocalypse. In reality, the Pentagon's magnetic tracking likely serves mundane, if crucial, purposes. Yet overlay those same precautionary grids onto public catastrophe maps, and suddenly it seems like foreknowledge of doom. Both can be true, facts precise, interpretations wild. So the evidence of magnetic drift is undeniable, the military's interest understandable, and the public's suspicion inevitable. Between an actual shifting field and a culture trained to fear secrecy, the gap narrows until maps once meant for calibration look like censored warnings of the next cataclysm. And maybe that's the quiet takeaway. Earth keeps moving whether we believe the theories or not. The question isn't if the poles will wander again. It's whether we can navigate truth without our compasses spinning. Interconnected risks and strategic secrecy. By the mid-2020s, the Pentagon's obsession with risk doesn't stop at magnetic drift. It expands into an entire worldview where every threat is linked to every other. Defense analysts call it cascading vulnerability, a single failure sparking a chain that lights up half the planet. Floods cut power, power kills communication, communication collapses coordination. In that system, secrecy becomes both shield and symptom, the reflex to hide fragility before anyone can exploit it. Here's how the chain connects. Start with the magnetic field, the quiet foundation for navigation, satellite orbit, even timing signals across global networks. Field instability, once a minor geophysical curiosity, now overlaps with climate volatility, resource scarcity, and digital dependency. A solar storm hits during a heat wave and cripples data centers powering water infrastructure. Suddenly, geomagnetic risk isn't geological trivia. It's the match that sets off economic and social collapse. That's the logic behind recent military doctrines. In 2025, internal review boards merged environmental monitoring with cyber defense under one office, integrated domain resilience. Its mandate reads, maintain operational continuity across cascading hazard events. Translation, protect everything from hackers, hurricanes, and magnetic anomalies alike. At first glance, it's bureaucratic housekeeping. Look closer, though, and it signals a philosophical shift. The Pentagon no longer separates natural disaster from deliberate attack. Both threaten control. Both require secrecy to manage without public panic. Civil institutions think differently. The United Nations Interconnected Disaster Risks Report for 2025 warns that governments can't solve compounding crises within silos. Yet the same report admits international coordination lags behind the speed of disaster amplification. Privately, defense strategists interpret that as license for autonomy. When alliances falter, nations fall back on self-contained survival planning. That's why military installations worldwide now double as humanitarian command hubs. They're not just bases, they're fail-safes for governance if civilian infrastructures fragment. In that light, the so-called Geophysical Transition Zone map makes grim sense. Whether real or myth, it embodies a classified mindset. Identify zones where multiple vulnerabilities intersect and quietly prepare for collapse. Climate stress, magnetic drift, population density, supply routes. Layer them together, color the danger, and call it contingency. It looks like conspiracy from the outside, but internally it's the mathematics of fear. The secrecy isn't purely sinister, it's strategic. Catastrophe modeling depends on public trust to function, but disclosure invites destabilization. Imagine announcing that certain regions fall inside a field failure corridor, where communication blackouts could last weeks. Markets crash overnight. Property values evaporate before a single transistor burns out. Planners choose silence not because they expect apocalypse, but because economic panic travels faster than geomagnetic waves. So the reports stay classified, whispered through acronyms none of us recognize. Yet every withheld detail deepens public suspicion. When agencies redact even benign findings, they reinforce the logic of the Adam and Eve story. That dangerous knowledge is always hidden for our own good. Thomas once warned that humanity forgets the past between cataclysms. Now, by choice, institutions repeat that forgetfulness through obscurity. Each unshared dataset becomes a modern myth, each missing appendix a doorway to speculation. There's another reason secrecy thrives: vulnerability itself. In Pentagon culture, revealing true fragility equals inviting attack. If adversaries learn that satellites or grids are susceptible during magnetic minima, they might time aggression accordingly. So classification doubles as defense. But that rationale, conceal weakness to prevent exploitation, creates an unintended moral hazard. Citizens remain naive when transparency could save lives. During the 2021 Texas grid collapse, delayed admission of system instability magnified chaos. Multiply that by a planetary scale, and you glimpse why critics call secrecy the first disaster within any disaster. This tension fuels the modern information paradox. The public demands evidence of government preparation. Governments fear revealing preparation confirms the worst rumors. The result: silence interpreted as certainty of doom. Inside think tank circles, advisors call it the trust inversion. Above ground, official reassurance. Underground, active modeling of collapse. Both may be rational, yet together they sound deceitful. Examples abound. After major solar flares in late 2024 temporarily jammed transatlantic communications, the Department of Defense quietly initiated MagStorm continuity drills across Air Force and Navy networks. Press releases described them as cybersecurity exercises. Only later did participants admit they practiced operating without GPS or standard magnetometers, essentially rehearsing high-radiation blackout scenarios. No civilians were told. By the time rumors leaked, conspiracy sites had rebranded the exercise as Operation Pole Reversal Readiness. The name stuck because it fit the pattern. Secrecy first, explanation never. Even international diplomacy adopts coded language. The 2025 Geneva Accords Appendix on Global Infrastructure Resilience includes an enigmatic clause encouraging member states to develop autonomous communication clusters independent of orbital orientation. To ordinary readers, it sounds like redundancy planning. Specialists recognized it immediately: low-orbit networks designed to survive magnetic field disruption. Another quiet intersection of scientific prudence and apocalyptic imagination. Inside the Pentagon, analysts debate how far preparation can go before it constitutes confession. One camp argues transparency would diffuse myths. The other insists ignorance preserves order. For now, the second wins. Documents from the Global Catastrophic Hazards Task Group, formed after pandemic instability, explicitly state that broader disclosure of low-probability events presents unacceptable behavioral risk. Translation: tell people too much, and they'll trigger the crisis themselves through panic. It's a paternal logic echoing Cold War secrecy: trust the guardians, not the masses. But in the digital age, guardianship dissolves the moment one insider leaks a slide deck. The leaks themselves have become currency. Whistleblowers chasing planetary justice and rivals seeking provocation exploit public hunger for revelation. Every data breach recontextualizes old myths: the CIA's redacted book, the Pentagon map, the magnetic drift. Individually, they're fragments. Together they form a mosaic convincing millions that a monumental secret is hiding in plain sight. Even when scientists publish real evidence debunking crustal shift cataclysm, the myth adapts, claiming validation through attention. The narrative thrives because it satisfies the emotional geometry of fear. Hidden cause, impending effect, righteous discovery. Ironically, secrecy may no longer protect security, it erodes it. Each classified phrase becomes an invitation for reinterpretation. Core field instability adjustment, meant as routine calibration, morphs online into evidence of impending pole crash. Public mistrust makes coordination harder when genuine emergencies strike. Officials conditioned to conceal continue concealing, civilians accustomed to doubt stop listening. The cycle mirrors geomagnetism itself, oscillation between order and chaos. Still, we can't discount real strategic necessity. Some threats truly can't be managed through open crowdsourcing. The 2025 Global Risk Index ranks systemic infrastructure collapse alongside nuclear conflict as civilization ending. Pentagon briefings echo that hierarchy. If simultaneous cyberattack and magnetic storm cripple electrical grids, recovery requires synchronized command. Too many voices would fragment response. Secrecy, in this limited sense, acts like the planet's magnetic field itself, an invisible shield absorbing shock. But when that shield weakens, invisible becomes perilous. And maybe that's the metaphor hiding inside this entire saga. We keep building layers of protection, physical, digital, informational, only to discover each layer generates its opposite pressure. The stronger the shield, the more suspicion gathers beneath it. Governments guard their data against chaos. Citizens build theories to restore agency. Around and around, magnetic north chasing south, truth chasing narrative. So when people ask what the Pentagon's secret map really shows, perhaps the answer isn't continents rearranged or oceans reborn. It's a psychological contour map of power and fear. Zones where transparency collapses under the weight of uncertainty. The coordinates don't mark future shorelines, they trace the edges of trust itself. The field may be shifting beneath our feet, but the greater movement is human. A lurch between belief and denial, science and myth, openness and control. In that movement lies the real pole shift, the inversion of who holds knowledge, and who decides when the world deserves to know. What the map really means. Maybe the real revelation isn't hidden in coordinates or redacted stamps. Maybe it's buried in our reaction, the way curiosity turns voids into monsters. The secret map has become the mirror held up to every fear we've learned to outsource to authority. It fuses credible science, magnetic drift, field weakening, with unresolved faith and control. When the continents glow red online, what people see isn't geology. They see power deciding who gets to panic and when. Take a step back and patterns soften. Magnetic poles do wander, the field does fluctuate. Governments undeniably plan for disruptions to satellites, navigation, and infrastructure. Yet none of that equals an approaching crustal cataclysm. What it reveals is simpler. Institutions frightened of vulnerability, citizens frightened of secrecy. Between them spreads a silence filled by speculation. Perhaps that's what the Pentagon map truly charts. Not the shifting of Earth's crust, but the shifting of trust. Red zones measure confidence, eroding under layers of classification. Each corridor marks a path between official caution and public imagination. The leaked image resonates because it confirms emotion, not prophecy. Someone somewhere is worried enough to draw boundaries around the unknown. We misname secrecy as certainty. In reality, those black files might hide misunderstanding as often as revelation. The same chart that conspiracy circles treat as apocalypse could just be a technical precaution, a forecast of communication failures during magnetic storms. But secrecy grants it theatrical power. Show the public a blank space, and they'll write scripture inside it. In that sense, the pole shift has already happened. It's psychological. Authority and belief have exchanged hemispheres. Scientists plead for nuance, social networks demand revelation. The compass of credibility spins. And in that whirling confusion, every myth, ancient flood, CIA redaction, UAP conspiracy, realigns into one shared map of anxiety. Look past the symbols, and you see the real constant. Humanity trying to predict what it can't prevent. The field beneath our feet keeps moving. So does the story. Both are natural phenomena seeking equilibrium. Maybe the purpose of these leaks, books, and rehearsals isn't to forecast doom at all, but to remind us how fragile communication becomes when fear outpaces information. That's what the Pentagon's so-called secret map ultimately represents. An atlas of vulnerability translated into defense planning. Its red lines trace not devastation, but the margins of comprehension, the places where science ends and imagination takes over. If you want to explore how another hidden file links this magnetic mystery to modern UAP propulsion research, watch the next investigation. Subscribe so you don't lose the thread, because the field is shifting, and our understanding is too.